flow. Practice in front of that mirror, girl, you twerking it on the dance floor. Practice in front of that mirror, girl, you twerking it on the practice in front of that mirror, girl, you twerking it on the dance floor. Practice in front of that mirror, girl, you twerking it on the floor. Twerking it on the dance floor. Twerking it on the dance floor. Twerking it on the dance floor.
All right, hey guys, so this video is going to be what I think I'll consider my most important video to date, and that's because I think it's the most controversial topic surrounding bodybuilding. And if you read the title of the video, you know that I'm going to be speaking about water and sodium manipulation leading into a bodybuilding competition. Now, within the community, this is known as the peak week, and a lot of different coaches and competitors have a lot of different approaches, and it's a very common view that bodybuilders will deplete water in the days leading up to the show so that they achieve that ultra tight look and that super thin skin that we often see in competitive bodybuilders. Now, the reason why I say this video is so controversial is that this is really the main reason why bodybuilders are getting hospitalized and dropping dead. This is a very important topic, and it's largely because of these practices that bodybuilding has gotten a bad rap by the public eye, and the use of things like diuretics and extreme water cuts and sodium depletions leading into a bodybuilding competition are extremely dangerous, and this is actually a pressing issue within the community. Now, with all of that out of the way, I'm going to say off the bat that this is probably going to be one of my longer videos because I want to delve into all the science and get all of the practical information in there as well. So just bear with me as I unpack all of the details here. I'm also going to break this video up into parts, and if you'd rather skip to a certain part, I'll put a link in the description box below so you can just click to the specific time where I'll speak on a specific topic. Now, I'd like to start this video off by saying that this discussion is going to be limited to natural bodybuilders, or that is to say, bodybuilders who are not using anabolic steroids or growth hormone. And the reason for this is that anabolic steroids and growth hormones have a known side effect of causing water retention. And now, before I dive right into the physiology of all this, I just want to say that there seems to be two main schools of thought within the natural bodybuilding community on this topic. The first, and what I think is the most predominant view now, is that we don't need to cut water at all, and it can actually be detrimental. While the other school of thought says that we need to manipulate water or sodium, or both, in order to really hit our peak on show day. So the first topic that I want to focus in on closely is our body's water compartments. All right, so if we imagine this diagram being all of our body's water together, about 2/3 of it is found in the intracellular space, and it's called intracellular fluid, and the rest is found in the extracellular space, and it's called the extracellular fluid. So the intracellular fluid includes the water that's found in our body's cells, so actually in the muscle cells, in our heart cells, in our liver cells, and all the other cells that make up our body. And then the extracellular fluid is found outside of the cells. And then the extracellular fluid is itself divided into 3 different compartments. So we have the interstitial space, which is basically the fluid that lies between the cells and the blood vessels. So if you cut your body open, it's not just going to be a big pool of blood in there. The blood is confined to the vessels, and then we also have organs in there, and these organs are sort of bathed in a interstitial fluid, and it's this fluid that makes up the interstitial space. Then we also have the plasma water, which is the water that actually makes up the blood, and it's in the blood vessels. And then we have the creatively named third space, which is mostly just cerebrospinal fluid, but it's so small that we can effectively ignore it. So now, as a bodybuilder, it's clear that we want the intracellular fluid to be high, since we want water in our muscle cells. This gives us that full and round-looking appearance. So now let's move on to the extracellular fluid. I already said that we can ignore the third space, so we have 2 spaces left, the interstitial space and the plasma water. We want the plasma water to be high because that's what gives us that vascular look on stage. So it's specifically the interstitial space that we want to target when we deplete water. Now, it's commonly assumed that this interstitial space is found just under your skin, but that actually isn't the case. In fact, muscle itself actually has a high volume of interstitial fluid, and it's the fluid that goes down into the T-tubules. And so we don't really want this fluid to be low. We also don't want the interstitial fluid around our organs and in between our blood vessels to be low, because that's just simply not under our skin, so we shouldn't really care about it. So the only type of interstitial fluid that we really care about is the specific layer of water that's under our skin. So in order to look at this a little bit more closely, I'm now going to turn to the layers of our skin and look at that a little bit more in depth. Okay, so we can see in this photo that the skin has 4 main layers. And then below that you have muscle or bone, which it attaches to. So let's just run through them really quickly. At the very top, you have a very thin layer of dead cells called the stratum corneum, which is just 20 to 30 cells thick, depending on the location, and you can pretty much ignore this. Any sort of exfoliation leading into the competition is basically going to do away with this layer. Then below that, you have the epidermis, which is the same thickness as a single strand of hair. Again, you can ignore this. Then below that, you have a layer called the dermis. And now the dermis ranges in thickness from 0.5 millimeter on the eyelids to as much as 3 millimeters on the back. And I think that this might vary from person to person and have a genetic component, but these seem to be the figures that are most often cited in the literature. Below this dermal layer, you have a layer of subcutaneous fat, which attaches to the underlying muscle or bone. And it's this layer that we shed off when we're dieting for our competition as we lose body fat. So throughout the rest of this video, keep in mind that it is this 0.5 to 3 millimeter thick dermal layer that we're really concerned with when we talk about shedding water before our show. Now this dermal layer is composed about 70 to 75% of water, and the rest of it is connective tissue. So of that 3 millimeters, at best, we're only looking at about a 2 millimeter reduction due to water manipulation at the very thickest point on the back. Now, I think that this is a good time to point out that there is no subcutaneous water layer that you see on the back of these water pills and in magazines. The only place that you see a diagram like this is on an advertisement that's promoting water pills. This blue layer of water that you see here, it just simply doesn't exist like this. If you look in any physiology textbook, what you'll instead see is a photo like this, where in this dermal layer that I mentioned, you actually have about 3/4 by composition water. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves is there a way to reduce the water in this dermal layer while keeping water everywhere else, especially in the muscle, high, so that we look full, but yet we keep our skin looking thin by getting rid of that water in that layer specifically? So as most of you guys know, there are basically 2 things that are manipulated leading into a show to try to achieve this. One is sodium and the other is water. So let's look at sodium first. Now it's common for people to try to deplete sodium throughout the course of a peak week, attempting to sort of dry out. But this is actually an exercise in futility, since depleting sodium in your diet doesn't actually change blood levels of sodium. The following 1990 Harvard study by Rogax et al. Illustrated this point perfectly when they reduced dietary sodium to pretty much 0 for 6 days, and then they measured the blood and urinary sodium levels in their subjects. What they found that even when sodium was cut almost completely from the diet, concentrations in the blood remained pretty much the same. So the point here is that your body so tightly regulates sodium and is so good at maintaining this homeostasis that it's pretty much futile to deplete sodium in your diet at the hopes of that having some sort of profound effect on your physiology. Furthermore, reducing sodium and increasing water intake, which many bodybuilders do leading into their competition, puts you at a great risk for a condition known as hyponatremia. And I'll just flash a list of signs and symptoms here on the screen in case you want to pause and read about what that's all about. And if that wasn't enough to convince you that depleting sodium leading into your show is a bad idea, we also know that depleting sodium reduces the effectiveness of a SGLT1 transporter that's responsible for shuttling glucose into the muscle, limiting your ability to absorb glucose into the muscle and achieve that full look that you're really looking for on show day. All right, so we now have established that depleting sodium is a bad idea at any rate, but what about loading it? So there are basically two ways that we can go about loading sodium. One way is chronically, by increasing our sodium for a very long period of time leading into the show. And the other way we can do it is acutely, so only increasing sodium intake very closely to the competition. Now, a 2005 study on the treatment of edema notes that sodium chloride intake generally is equivalent to output over the course of a few days. When intake increases, there is a compensatory increase in sodium chloride excretion after a lag period. Thus, extracellular fluid volume can be maintained at a constant level despite wide fluctuations in intake. However, if this fluctuation is too wide and too long, sodium intake simply exceeds the rate at which the kidneys can flush it out, and there will simply be an excess of sodium in your system that will serve as a sufficient stimulus for antidiuretic hormone release, which will cause your body to retain water. Now, some of this fluid will build up in the vessels and then leak out into the interstitial spaces, including the dermal space, which is exactly where we don't want it. And this is often what you'll see in competitors who binge after their competition for a few days. They simply take in so much sodium that their body spills out the rest of that water, and they end up developing pockets in weird places, and they see swelling in places like their ankles. But what about the other type of sodium loading that I mentioned, the acute loading of sodium? A 2008 paper on the acute effects of sodium ingestion concluded that a high sodium meal may cause transient pressure increases, but in healthy people, acute sodium ingestion does not cause sustained hypotension, or hypertension, or high blood pressure. So when we eat a really high sodium meal, our blood pressure actually does go up for a little bit, but then it goes back to normal. So what is it that causes the blood pressure to go back to normal? Well, it's actually the fact that our blood vessels dilate, creating more volume, and therefore reducing the pressure. Now, blood vessels dilating is a very good thing for a bodybuilder because that means that they're going to look more vascular. And just to verify this, I'm going to cite a 1995 study that investigated the effect of sodium intake on vasodilation, which concluded, studies in animals suggest that nitric oxide production is increased under conditions of salt loading, and that this increase protects against the development of salt-induced hypertension. Okay, so now we've established that chronically loading sodium for a long period of time at very high intakes can cause edema and is a bad idea. It makes us look watery. However, acutely loading sodium can increase vasodilation. Okay, so based on all of this evidence, it seems clear to me that maintaining a constant, moderate sodium intake similar to your intake in the weeks and months leading into your competition, and then increasing your sodium intake either the night before the competition or at the very least on show day itself. And this is a part of the reason why I think a lot of people look better the day after their show. It's because after they went out and ate all of those nachos and pizza, they ended up filling out their muscles and they got the vasodilation that you see from increasing sodium intake. Now, just as a little anecdote here, my good friend Jose, who I competed against in a lightweight class at the Muscle Mayhem, was backstage eating slice of pizza after slice of pizza, and he said, "Jeff, here, man, come on, have a slice of pizza." And I was a little bit tentative. I had already eaten a few ham and cheese sandwiches, which are very high in sodium. I also didn't really want to bloat myself. But just take a look at this picture. You'll see how full and vascular he actually looks. And he saw no extracellular fluid retention because he had spiked his sodium very high on show day, but had maintained a good balance of sodium in the days leading into that. All right, so that covers sodium. Now let's move on to water intake. So traditionally, bodybuilders would just stop drinking water, and The hope was that they would get rid of this subcutaneous layer of water under their skin that we've already addressed and have come to the conclusion that it doesn't really exist like people think it does. Now, the problem with reducing water intake is that you're going to lose water from everywhere. You're going to lose water from all body compartments. So it doesn't seem perfectly clear to me that the best way to deplete specifically this dermal layer of water is by simply reducing your intake of water leading into the show. Now, as far as I know, there isn't any real clear or obvious way of specifically targeting this layer. And given the fact that there is way more water in the intracellular fluid than there is in this dermal layer specifically, I think that depleting water before your competition, especially somewhat carelessly, especially if you reduce sodium as well, is a really good way to flatten out and just end up looking stringy and depleted on stage. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't ways to peak and there aren't ways that you can manipulate water to actually improve your appearance on stage, and I'm going to get to these now. So the first concept is the idea of dry carb loading. This is where you reduce water intake, let's say one day leading up to the show, and drastically increase carb intake at the same time. And the idea behind this protocol is that the increase in muscle glycogen will pull water into the muscle, keeping the intracellular fluid volume high while the extracellular fluid volume flushes out. Now, I've heard this idea proposed by Lyle McDonald, who is a good friend of mine, and it seems to hold some promise. It at least makes intuitive sense to me that it might work. This isn't an approach that I've necessarily used myself in the past, but I could see it working as long as you jack your carbs up high enough, you keep your sodium high as well, and you aren't too drastic with your water cut. Maybe just reducing it by something like 50 to 75% 24 hours out from the competition. Okay, so the second strategy that I'd like to mention has to do with the idea of cutaneous transpiration. So when we look at sources of water loss in a diagram like this one, we see that urine contributes the most, but in the middle there in blue, we see cutaneous transpiration, which accounts for about 300 milliliters of water loss per day. Now, I want to mention that cutaneous transpiration is not the same thing as sweating. Just imagine putting your hand on a cold mirror. You'll notice that steam accumulates around your hand. Well, that steam is actually caused from cutaneous transpiration, which is the movement of water through and from that dermal layer out to and off of your skin. So the question is there a way that we can practically increase cutaneous transpiration, since this would actually specifically target that layer of water that's directly under your skin? Now, I've given this some thought, and I'm not really sure that there is a way to do it, but a few ideas have come to mind. One has to do with the fact that whenever I've noticed that I get out of a tanning bed, I seem to be much drier looking than I am before I go in the tanning bed. And I also notice that when I'm out standing in the sun, I tend to dry out more. My skin tends to look a little bit thinner. I get a little bit more vascular. And I'm sympathetic towards the idea that the evaporative losses of water from underneath the skin has something to do with this. So to offer practical advice based on this experience, I think it's a really good idea to just stay warm leading into your competition. If you compete in a cold climate like I do, and it's cold backstage, it's really important that you keep your feet warm. I always wear slippers backstage at a competition to make sure that my body temperature is high. Also, you want to wear warm clothing, warm baggy clothing to make sure that you're staying warm. It also might not be a bad idea to bring a small space heater like you would use to heat up a tent, just to make sure that your body is staying warm and you're taking advantage of every bit of this cutaneous transpiration that you can. Similarly, if you are competing in a warm climate like I did in California, I actually spent a lot of time outside in the sun, and I think that this might have had something to do with the fact that I did peak really well for that competition. All right, now before I give my official recommendations for water intake during peak week, I just want to quickly touch on two hormones that are very important with regard to this discussion. Those are antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. I'm going to keep this really short, so I'm going to lose some of the complexity here. But essentially, antidiuretic hormone is responsible for retaining water. Diuresis just means to pee. So antidiuretic hormone is going to retain water. Aldosterone is the other one that's responsible for retaining sodium. And it's this reason that why when you deplete sodium in your diet, it doesn't change your blood levels of sodium. Your body simply pumps out more aldosterone, your kidneys retain more sodium, and then your body maintains that constant level of sodium in your blood. Now, when we're speaking about these hormones, ADH is synthesized, transported, and stored within 1 to 2 hours, and it has a half-life of 10 to 35 minutes. Similarly, aldosterone has a half-life of less than 20 minutes, which indicates that when we're speaking about these hormones, we're talking about changes on an hour-to-hour basis instead of a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. They can change their concentrations very, very quickly. So to me, this seems to vastly undermine the importance of loading up on water with the intended purpose of increasing the levels of these hormones, leading into your sudden cut of water. As soon as you cut the water, within an hour or two, these hormones will have already spiked extremely high, and you'll start seeing retention of water very, very quickly. So when it comes to water manipulation, I would suggest one of two very conservative protocols. The first is simply keeping water intake the same all throughout peak week and then keeping it the same on show day. The second protocol is to keep water the same all throughout peak week and then decrease it slightly sometime Friday evening. And when you decrease it Friday evening, that would be a good time to also start very heavily loading up on carbs. This has to do with the dry loading protocol that I mentioned earlier. Now, I do want to admit that I can see the second protocol backfiring more easily, and I could see an athlete flattening out more easily using the second protocol. So I tend to favor the first protocol. However, in some people that really do seem to have that thick dermal layer, especially on their back, I think that there might be something to dry carb loading, and it might be something that you want to play around with as long as you do so very conservatively. My practical recommendations when it comes to sodium, I've already touched on this, but I recommend keeping it constant all throughout peak week, and then on Friday night or at the least Saturday morning, early Saturday morning, having a meal very high in sodium like pizza or a ham and cheese sandwich or some sushi. But it's important that you stick to foods that you know you will handle and digest well. If you haven't had pizza for 6 months, this is a little bit risky. You might see some bloating there. It might be better just to stick to a food that's high in sodium and you also know that you're going to be able to handle well. You could simply just salt your food very heavily and it would achieve the same purpose. Now, another thing that I want to note here is that while I do recommend keeping sodium constant throughout peak week, I think it's sort of futile to measure this extremely precisely. And this has to do with the fact that, like I said before, your body is very good at maintaining a constant level of sodium in the blood. So having an extreme precision with the amount of sodium that you're taking in doesn't really make much sense because your body sort of already regulates this extremely precisely for you. The idea is to keep your sodium just sort of constant so that you don't see any sort of funky changes in water intake, your weight doesn't get thrown off too much, and you don't freak yourself out in the sort of days leading up to the competition. Now, as for when exactly you should start increasing your sodium, this is something that you might just have to play around with and figure out what works best for you. And it would be a good idea to actually try this out in the weeks leading into your competition. So keep sodium set at around, let's say, 3,000 milligrams per day for a week, and then drive it all the way up to 8,000 milligrams one Friday night, and then see how you look Saturday morning. And you can do this without actually having to change your macronutrient intake simply by salting your food. For me, I actually notice an increase in vascularity for 1 to 2 days if I increase my sodium intake over the course of a full day. And I won't notice that I actually spill over until, let's say, 2 or 3 days of very heavy sodium loading. So for me, increasing my sodium intake about halfway through Friday, so say around 5 p.m. on Friday, I'll start to increase my sodium fairly heavily, and then all throughout Saturday I have very high sodium, usually in the form of ham and cheese sandwiches, and that gives me a very full vascular look. Now next time I probably will be taking Jose's advice and indulging in some of that pizza. Since looking at this photo again, it's got me thinking that I probably could have been a little bit more vascular even at the Muscle Mayhem. Alright guys, so this has been a very long video, and if you've made it this far, I want to thank you for sticking with me. And before I finish up, I just want to say that I think that peak week is, for the most part, massively overrated within the community. And yes, increasing carbohydrates and increasing sodium can really make a profound difference on someone's physique. Just as an example, I'm going to flash up a photo here of me about 3 days out from the Muscle Mayhem. You can see that I'm looking very tight, but also pretty flat looking. And then here is another pic of me after I had filled up with some sodium, after I had eaten some carbs. Now I want to say that a lot of people freak out about this way too much, and that can actually have a detrimental effect on them. So by being so concerned with their peak week, they drive their cortisol way up, and that actually can be a sufficient stimulus to cause water retention, and it can actually cause them to look significantly worse on show day, unfortunately. I think it would be much better to actually take a little bit of a more nonchalant approach with this and simply recognize the fact that your body is going to do most of the regulation for you. That isn't to say that physiques can't change very drastically throughout the course of the peak week. They actually can in terms of fullness and vascularity. However, if you've done your homework, you've put in the work with the diet and the cardio and the training and all the rest that goes into a contest prep, up until 7 days out from your competition, and you're lean, you're going to look good on show day. You'd have to do something very unintelligent with your peak week, something very drastic, in order to actually look a lot worse on show day. So I just wanted to emphasize that so that people don't stress out about this too much. And I'm just gonna flash a couple photos of some people who do virtually nothing on peak week other than increase their carbs, and they keep their water completely the same all the way through prep. Here's a picture of Lane Norton, picture of Alberto Nunez. Here's a pic of the three of us at the Muscle Mayhem, Frank, myself, and Jose. And none of us cut water. In fact, I think the other two guys were drinking ridiculous amounts of water, something like 8 liters on show day. So this just goes to show that as a natural athlete, it isn't mandatory that we cut water leading into a show, and you can achieve a very tight look without this. And I also wanted to say that what we're talking about here is a 0.5 to 3 millimeter thick layer, and people are getting hospitalized and actually dropping dead by taking diuretics set towards reducing this layer to 2 millimeters or to 1 millimeter from 3 millimeters. It's simply just not worth it in the grand scheme of things, and I would much rather see a lot more competitors drinking water backstage. I don't want to see people with their lips getting stuck to their teeth on stage. It's really a sad thing that happens in this community way too often, when you see people getting hospitalized and getting sick and not having fun on show day. I've depleted water before, and I'll tell you, it feels like death. And if you can't enjoy yourself on show day, there's something wrong with that too, right? So I think it's important that we sort of put this in perspective, realize what it is actually that we're dealing with here, and then move forward in the most intelligent way possible. Alright guys, so I know I covered a lot of stuff in this video. I'm going to put a quick bullet list up here on the screen and just read through it just to recap on all the stuff that I said so far. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, guys. Please don't forget to like my video, and please do subscribe to the channel. We've almost hit 1,000 subscribers, and when we do, we're gonna make a special video for you guys thanking you for your support. All right, so here we go. Natural bodybuilders don't have to worry about water retention as much as bodybuilders using anabolics. The water layer we are really concerned with is the dermal layer, which is 0.5 to 3 millimeters thick under the skin. Depleting sodium is always a bad idea because it doesn't change blood sodium concentration. It reduces carb absorption into the muscle. It puts you at risk of hyponatremia. A prolonged heavy sodium load is also a bad idea because it can lead to edema. A short-term sodium load before showtime is a good idea because it will increase fullness and vascularity without affecting extracellular fluid volume. Limiting water intake is a bad idea because there is no known way to selectively lose dermal water without also losing intramuscular water and plasma water, causing you to flatten out. Two exceptions to this may be dry carb loading and cutaneous transpiration. In the end, by the time peak week comes, you should already be very lean and should already have glute striations if you're a male competitor. If you're depending on water, then you're going to drown. Okay guys, thank you very much for watching this video. Feel free to add to the conversation by commenting below, sharing any studies or opinions that you may have. And please do share this video. I'm not saying that for my own selfish reasons, but rather to make people more aware of the fact that there is a way to do this that is much more safe and equally, if not more effective.
Like a waterfall falling slow.
All drum. Euros. I just like when I can tell you I told you so.
God's gift, no ribbon on it. When I was grinding for that moment, y'all was wishing on it. Opportunity, clearly you niggas did.